Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back from whatever kind of break you had. We have a wonderful afternoon in front of us. So much more content, so many more experts that you will meet on stage. Our first keynote after the break is called Understanding Social Choices, Insights from Decision Neuroscience. Go to yourself. I'll go to myself. Think about the decisions you've made in the last hour. From the mundane, such as how much more coffee should I drink, to the highly consequential choices, such as should I go out for a walk during lunch to lower my blood pressure in order to have a healthier life when I'm in my 80s. The complexity of studying decision-making increases where one person's outcome depends on the choices of others and their outcomes on you. That is what's called social decision-making. In this talk that we'll now hear, Professor Alan Sanfey will outline an experimental approach using functional brain imaging and computational modeling to observe how players decide in real, consequential, and social contexts. Professor Alan Sanfey, he's a professor of Decision Neuroscience at the Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, and also a principal investigator at the Donders Institute for Brain, Cognition and Behavior. He's here live. Please make some noise in the house for Professor Alan Sanfey. Welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Can I ask you, what's the toughest decision you took so far today?
Today, I had a lot of deliberation about my breakfast, and I won't bore everyone with the intricate details, but even very small decisions can sometimes be...
Some brain cells were wasted there between the choice of what, cereal or eggs?
It was eggs and cereal, I'm afraid. So I won't spoil the finish by letting you know what I had, so maybe at the end we can have a...
Any consequential decisions?
Well, I think coming here was a potentially consequential decision. So a luxury decision, do I travel to Stockholm or present remotely? And a decision like that, even though it's only positive, there's still a lot of factors to consider about pros and cons. And they can be quite difficult to assess the environmental damage of traveling versus the opportunity to see people in person. And so even not very hard decisions or not very consequential decisions are still difficult at times.
We already have questions coming in through the question page and through our QR code. Maybe we can show the QR code again. So you know that there will be time after your speech for questions, and I know you look forward to that. But I'll leave the stage to you, and camera here, audience here. Warm welcome again.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so my interaction with technology is mostly as a user. So I've been very impressed by this morning and the technological and digital developments we see. I'm just happy somebody invents large machines that lets me scan the brain and shows me where the large on-off button is. So technology has been a great boon to my own research. I was particularly heartened earlier by hearing the human being involved in the technological and digital process. And I really think that's crucial, that we look at how people and people's behaviors and values integrate with technology and digitalization in order to try and push us forward into building, indeed, better societies. So the behavior I'm most interested in is decision making. And as Beata mentioned, we make many, many decisions every day, some which seem trivial. We heard this morning about trying to train the chair going through a busy market and how challenging that can be. We do it effortlessly. We navigate through crowded metro stations without bumping into anybody, even when most of us seem to be on our phone at the same time. It doesn't seem to matter. And we can go from there to very important decisions. Where am I going to live? What's my career going to be? How do I allocate scarce resources amongst deserving people? And I really think this is a key aspect of being human, is trying to understand one's decision making. And I think both from the perspective of understanding our own behavior, but maybe even more importantly from the perspective of enacting public policy. If we want to introduce policies that are going to have a positive and beneficial societal outcome, it does behoove us to understand how are people going to respond to these policies. What decisions will they make? What choices will they make? And are they in line with what we're trying to get people to do? Now, this is an ambitious goal, and there's a couple of challenges, I think, along the way. So one is that this has been a very siloed field of research. Different disciplines have investigated decision-making at quite different levels, using different techniques, and the lack of contact between these disciplines has, I think, hurt the development of these models. And secondly, on the policy applied dimension, I think often we're influenced by what we can measure instead of what we should measure. So an example of that might be if we want to look at the welfare of a society, one relatively straightforward measure is something like GDP. It's computable, it seems to capture something, it's concrete. Now, of course, however, it may not be the most useful indicator of the well-being of a society. So I think we should be guided by what's important to us as people when we make our decisions, what are the motivations that underlie our decisions, and then think about how we can use technology and digitalization to help us understand these in a deeper way. So what I want to do over my next few minutes is give a little tour through how we study these kind of questions in the lab, and just give a few example insights as to what we've learned about how people make decisions and choices and how they could possibly be useful for thinking about public policy. So a couple of very quick insights that are not new, but I think are interesting. I'm going to just quickly go through, before I do that, quickly go through the different type of disciplines that we kind of amalgamate together. So we're interested in kind of psychological models, economic models, and neuroscientific models. And ideally, we want to look at the convergence of all these three methods and theories to try and build better models of how we choose. So what insights have we come up with? So one quite simple insight is in the domain of risk. So let's imagine you all come into my laboratory, and I give you a very simple experiment. I say to you, you can choose one of two options. You can flip a coin. If it lands on heads, you win €1,000. But if it lands on tails, you get nothing. Okay, that's option A. Option B is you can simply get €500 for sure. I'll hand it over and you can leave. So this is a very simple choice on one hand. So maybe we can do a quick audience poll. So which of you would pick option A, flip the coin? Who would flip the coin here? There's always a few coin flippers. Who would not flip the coin? Who would take my money? Okay, so the overwhelming majority of people chose option B here. And this is an extremely predictable finding in terms of behavior, but it's not so trivial in terms of thinking about the economic model behind it. From a purely economic perspective, these two models are identical in the sense that on average, the left option will give you €500, and on average, the right option will give you €500. So from a pure economic perspective, you shouldn't have a preference, but people clearly do. So this is a phenomenon known as risk aversion. We tend to steer away from options that involve risk and uncertainty, right? We don't like uncertainty. Okay, so that's one principle, and we can show then how the systematic rational model of human behavior is perhaps not completely accurate. So let me give you one more example here. So I bring you back into the lab and I say, okay, we have this other experiment. This time you're going to flip a coin, and let's imagine I have somehow ethical approval to extract money directly from your bank account. So option A here is you flip a coin. If it's heads, you have to pay me €1,000. Okay? Let's assume I can really take this from you. However, if it lands on tails, nothing happens. You get to walk away. Or option B, you can just give me €500 and we save all the trouble of coin flipping. Okay? So we do a quick poll again. Who now wants to flip the coin? Okay, so obviously we practice these demonstrations, so everybody nicely behaves as we predict. And of course, what happens here, for those of you at home, what happened was we saw what's called a preference reversal. Now, nearly everybody chose to flip the coin. So now clearly, people aren't always averse to risk. Now they're choosing the risky option. So what's happening here? Well, we think what's happening here is a phenomenon called loss aversion. That even worse than the risk is the thought of losing something. The thought of just handing over €500 to me for nothing is so painful, you'd rather take the chance and hopefully get back to zero. And of course, this is a phenomenon that has a lot of real-world implications. We see gamblers often chasing their losses, trying to get back to zero, and often causing themselves even more harm. So these are kind of two principles that are very well replicated across many experiments. And they do have, I think, serious consequences. So if we think about climate change and climate emergency, and we think about what are we asking people to do to change their behavior in a positive way? Well, what we're asking them to do is choose for something that's risky and uncertain. We're saying, if you change your behavior now, there will be some uncertain positive benefit in a long period of time, right? That's not good for people to choose for. And we're also saying to them, in order to have this positive long-term benefit, you have to lose something now, okay? You have to give up your car, you have to stop eating meat, you can't travel to Stockholm. So in a way, the climate problem is almost perfectly designed to be very difficult for people to make good decisions about, good in the sense of positive decisions for climate amelioration. So I think understanding these principles then becomes really important in trying to define better policy, which will hopefully help us with these problems. So these are simple insights. We can get a little bit deeper and look at what we might call social insights. So this is a picture from my adopted home of the Netherlands. If you've never been to the Netherlands, this is a pretty good representation. It's perfectly flat. It's always a little bit sunny and a little bit cloudy, and people are quite modest, and so they have small ice cream cones. So you might think this is about as good as life gets in the lowlands. So you're all socially sensitive enough, I think, to realize, why doesn't this woman look happy? She should look happy. This is good times. And when I show you the rest of the picture, it becomes usually abundantly obvious to everybody why she isn't happy. And this is a classic case of what we call social comparison, okay? My ice cream cone was fine until this guy showed up and made me feel bad about what a small treat I have. And of course, we all have this in greater or lesser extents. We compare ourselves to our colleagues, our neighbors, our friends. So it's a very powerful phenomenon. And it illustrates, I think, the power of social motivations, that in addition to the simple economic motivations of the previous couple of examples, these social preferences can really drive behavior. And I think we don't, as of yet, have a really good understanding of social preferences and try to build them into our policy. So I'm going to give you two quick examples of specific social preferences that we've shown to be influence our decision making, and we can think a bit about how that might be relevant for larger scale problems. So one social motivation is fairness, or more specifically unfairness, and the power of what people do when they feel unfairly and unjustly treated. If you have teenage and pre-teenage children, as I have, you know that fairness is a very, very important consideration, and things have to be equal, and if things aren't equal, there's going to be problems. So, and then up to real and important consequential situations, we know that there's kind of climate justice movement is very strong. You can remember the protestations about bankers' bonuses several years ago. It just seemed profoundly unfair that these people were getting rewarded for putting us in economic difficulty. So how do we study fairness? How do we feel when we're treated unfairly? What do we do about it? What are our decisions? And how stable are these feelings over time? So I'll give a very quick example to try and illustrate how we study these questions. So to study these questions, we use very simple economic tasks. So you would come into our lab, you would meet Paul. Paul is a real person. And we tell you that you and Paul are going to play a game. You're going to have to simply divide some money that I provide between the two of you. So I give Paul €10. And I tell Paul it's his job to divide that money between you and him. And he can divide this whatever way he wants, right? That's his choice. And then you have to make a decision about that allocation. So let's imagine Paul does the following. He says, okay, I'm going to keep 8 and you get 2. And you can even, in your mind, visualize Paul pushing these 2 solitary euro coins towards you while he keeps a little pile of 8 on his own. Now you have to make a decision, and this is what we're interested in here. And the decision is as follows. You can either accept Paul's allocation, in which case Paul gets 8, you get 2, and the game is over. Or you can say no. You can reject Paul's allocation, in which case nobody gets anything. I take all the money back and the game is over. Okay? So the basic question I'll ask you is, Are you going to accept or reject Paul's offer? So who here would accept Paul's offer and take the €2? And who here would reject Paul's offer? So it's about 50-50, which you're a great audience. You're perfectly in line with our data. So in one hand, of course, it's profoundly economically irrational to turn down Paul's money. You're basically saying, I prefer 0 over 2, right? Which even the very simplest economic models do not predict that. So why do people do this? And of course, you can, as humans, you can introspect and realize why people do this, right? It just doesn't feel right. Not only does Paul think that he deserves 8 and you deserves 2, he thinks that you think you deserve that too, because he's expecting you to say yes. So there's a lot of layers of insult in this very simple interaction. So what do people do? And I should preface this by saying, when we say people, most of these experiments have been tested on European and North American. So there are some interesting cultural differences. So the data I'm going to show you are from our kind of standard population that we study here, but it's not necessarily universal. So here's what people do. On the bottom of this graph, I'm showing you the proportion of the offers. So Paul offers you 50%, 30%, 20%, 10%. And on the vertical axis, I'm going to show you what people do. So when Paul offers you 50%, unsurprisingly, everybody says yes. No one has a problem with fairness, okay? When Paul offers you 30 to 40%, people are willing to take it. They're not terribly happy, but Paul has a slight advantage in this game, and they're willing to give him that. But when Paul tries to, give you 20% or 10%, then the acceptance rates really fall off a cliff. And as you can see, about 50% of the time, just like in this room, these low offers are routinely rejected. So people are here placing a monetary value on a social preference, right? They're saying, I don't want to be part of this unfair interaction, and I'm willing to sacrifice money in order to do so. We can see this reflected in the brain, so we can do brain imaging and look at parts of the brain that seem to be particularly sensitive to unfairness. One of these areas is the insula here, which is parts of the brain which is involved in negative emotional processing. And interestingly, is also involved in social norms and expectations. So we come to these tasks with specific expectations, and when they're not met, we often want to punish Paul in return. And then we can look and see to what degree are these preferences stable. So if Paul offers me €2 today, is my answer the same as if Jack offers me €2 next week? And it turns out people are surprisingly unstable with their preferences. Most of us like to think we have a line in the sand and Paul cannot push us, but it turns out these are somewhat unstable. So this is our standard acceptance rate of 50% for an unfair offer. We can put people into positive emotional state. It doesn't really do much, but if we put people into a negative emotional state, then they really respond. They really say no to unfairness. We can prime them cognitively, we can overload them and push the rates up and down. And the most powerful thing we can do is say, Paul is a really nice guy, he always offers 50%, and then he offers you 20%. And that's extremely irritating to people, and then we get this very, very low acceptance rate when you feel singled out. Okay, so in terms of take home from fairness, as I mentioned, these perceptions, I think, are very powerful choice motivators, not just in these lab studies, but in the real world. We see brain areas active that we know are responsive to negative states and expectations. And these responses are somewhat context sensitive, so we don't have the same response equally across all situations. So I'll very quickly talk about it. Not to leave you all thinking about unfairness and injustice, we can talk about a more positive social preference here, that of prosocial choices. So when we kind of do someone a favor. This is being termed an economic puzzle, mostly by economists, because it's difficult to, again, account for in the standard model. So why would we help a stranger? Why would we give to charity if there's no direct economic benefit to us? Why are we making these prosocial choices? And so when are we prosocial? Under what circumstances? And maybe more interesting, what is the exact motivation that's helping us be prosocial? What's guiding our decisions in this way? So a different task, I'll just show you quickly how we study this. This is a game called the Trust Game. It's a slightly more complicated version of the Ultimatum Game. So you're going to play with Jack. Now Jack is being given the €10, and this is a two-step game. So first, Jack has the opportunity to transfer some money to you, in a sense to invest money with you. And whatever money Jack sends over to you, I'm going to multiply. So let's imagine Jack sends you 8 of his 10. The experimenter, me, is going to multiply this by 4. So what you actually get then is 32 euro. And Jack knows this, and you know that Jack knows, and so on. And now the second part of the game is you have the opportunity to send money back to Jack, but importantly, you don't have to. Okay? So it's your choice. There's you, there's Jack, there's 32 euros, and there's the door. And you can take this money and walk out, and nobody can do anything about it. Or you can choose to give some proportion back to Jack. So the question we ask people in this experiment simply is, how much of this 32 euro do you want to return to Jack? Does someone want to give me a personal preference? How much would you give to Jack? 16, I hear. 15 or 16 is a very popular response, right? I give Jack kind of half of what I get. Would anybody give Jack 0? You don't have to identify yourself, it's fine. There are people amongst you who will give Jack back 0, and that's perfectly valid in the context of this game. And also, if in the sense of real life, if I find 32 euros in the ground, I don't turn around and hand half of it to the person who would have found it if I hadn't been there. So what we're interested in this here is, are people pro-social? And the answer is yes, they are. But particularly, what motivates them to be pro-social? So what are the kind of guiding principles here? And so what we've tried to do here is break people down into different groups. So a step beyond the last experiment where we just say people don't like unfairness, here we say people do like to be pro-social, but why? So, of course, so one group, there's always the greedy people. There's greedy people everywhere, so we'll quickly dispense with them. These are the people who don't give Jack anything. There's a group of people who seem to be motivated by what we call equity concerns. That is, they care about doing the right thing and about fairness. And if I have 32 and Jack has been nice to me, it's only fair that I give Jack back 16 of that. So that seems to be the guiding principle, right? It's a kind of a moral principle of fairness and equity. There's another group of people, however, who seem to be guided by what we might call expectation. As an Irish Catholic, I recognize this as guilt, as a very powerful motivation to behavior. And this is the sense that Jack has been nice to me, and Jack therefore probably expects something nice in return. So here I'm not guided by my own principles, internal principles. I'm guided by what I think Jack expects. And I don't want Jack to leave feeling bad. So I'm going to give him money back because that's going to make him happy. And often these kind of predict the same response, but sometimes they don't. So these are maybe the pure motivation people. And then we also have an interesting group of people who are actually the majority, who turn out to be what we call moral opportunists. So these are people who are moral. They give Jack money back, but they have shifting principles. And perhaps not coincidentally, that their shifting principles seem to shift as a function of how well it's going to benefit them. So if they think Jack doesn't expect a lot of money back, they think, you know what, I'm going to make Jack happy and give him back a small amount of money. However, if they think Jack expects a lot of money back, then all of a sudden they become equity focused and think, you know what's right is to give half of the money I have. So it's these kind of shifting principles around the kind of general benefit to you. And we can see in this slightly complicated figure, you can see each dot here represents a particular participant in our study. And you can see that people are across the whole space. But we can start to categorize people as a function of their behavior and as a function of these model parameters. We can also categorize them as a function of their brain activity. So we can look here and see, do greedy people, are their brain representations the same, for example? Are equity people, are their brain representations the same? And this turns out to be the case. So people who are equity following have activity in a certain set of brain regions. People who are expectation following have activity in a different set of brain regions. And people who are moral opportunists seem to shift their brain pattern as a function of behavior. So don't worry about the details, but the important thing here is that we can start to be a bit more fine-grained on people's motivations, that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And this is just very briefly to show we can see these distributions of strategies along the bottom here. And what this shows is that these distributions are very similar with different groups of people. So we can test completely different groups of people and we get the same kind of distributions of personality types and distributions of decision types across those. Okay, so to sum up from this, I think one thing we've shown here is that we can quantify prosocial behavior, which is often being thought of as quite fuzzy and hard to define. Here we can quantify it both in terms of computational models, but also in terms of the brain. We can show that there's different motivations evident across different people. So perhaps there's a kind of a moral phenotype that people are develop that leads them to behave prosocially in certain ways. And I think this quote from another Irishman, George Bernard Shaw, sums it up well. So we all know the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Shaw suggests, do not do unto others as you would want them to do unto you, as their tastes may not be the same. And I think this captures this notion of we have to understand other people in order to enact prosocial policy. So last slide, just to summarize, what I've tried to show here is the importance of non-economic motivations in understanding decision making. We care about fairness, we care about prosociality, we care about trust, revenge, spite, and we also care about risk and uncertainty, and we need to understand those. I think interdisciplinary work is a really good venue for this. If we take theories and methods from different fields, we can leverage a lot of interesting insights into how people make decisions. And I think there is a great potential usefulness here in informing societal questions. I think that's really the next stage of this research, is to how we think about these phenomena in terms of real social and consequential decisions. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Sanfey. There are several questions.
Sure.
Can machines ever make abstract decisions without consciousness and without taking into account some of the factors that you've outlined?
Well, I think those factors would have to be programmed in or developed some way. I think there's a lot of interesting work around decision support systems. So how do we build systems? And I think early work had been, we actually want emotion out of these systems because the thought was emotion as a biasing factor. But I think what we're seeing now is that emotion, and particularly these social emotions, are important to consider. And so I think one challenge is, how do we conceptualize those and how do we build those into systems? So I don't. How
do you conceptualize fairness, for example?
We can conceptualize very easily equity. Fairness is quite different because equity kind of refers to the distribution, and fairness is our subjective experience of that, and that can be subtly different. So I think it's complicated but not impossible. But I think it is important that we think about these social motivations when we're thinking about these.
That's the road ahead.
I think so. Yes.
And then are we categorizing people or their actions in that situation? Meaning, can people change, or do you have longitudinal studies that they don't change?
So that's the main area we're studying now. Actually, is so these moral categories I mentioned. How stable are people? And so there seems to be stability in a population. That is, there's a similar proportion. One very open question is there stability within people? So do you behave the same way across different contexts and across time? And presumably there is learning. People do change and develop. But it's, I think, an open question as to whether there's a kind of a core stability in one's moral preferences or whether it's really labile. So that's.
Is there a core stability?
I don't have data. My guess would be yes. There's some core stability, and there might be perturbations according to context, but that fundamentally will behave similarly across context. But that's an empirical question.
There is another question here about. Can we say that fairness, loss averse, and risk averse means the same for all people, all countries, all cultures? And the person asking this question says, I felt the audience was aligned to data as well, as we all are privileged with a lot of peer influence, as our actions are available for scrutiny by people sitting around. Can this be the same for all, bearing local context and circumstance?
Yeah, so I mean, two things there. One, the question is a good one, that we can't necessarily generalize across cultures and contexts. And I think there's a lot of really interesting work going and looking and seeing how these type of preferences may be stable across cultures. We know that certain cultures that have very different norms around giving and receiving. Some cultures it's very rude not to give all of your money away, and in some cultures it's considered really strange to give any away. So I will preface all of this by saying that these are data from our kind of Western student populations. I think the second question about the social scrutiny is also quite interesting. The degree to which we behave in a isolation and if no one can see us versus we're doing kind of self-presentation. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on looking at the difference between overt behavior and covert behavior. And I think online systems might have quite an interesting aspect to play in this regard.
This is a question about shortcuts. What learning effects are easiest to override? Social learning, intrinsic learning rules of reciprocating trust, inclination for altruism, or norm abiding?
That's a complicated question. Which are easiest? I'm not sure we can talk about which are easiest to overcome. I mean, I think it really depends on the context. In different contexts, you'll rely on different types of learning and different types of rules. So I'd be loath to give you a ranked list of hard to easy, but they certainly all contribute to our representation of a scenario and our ability to make decisions about it. So we have to examine all of them, and particularly how they interact.
Professor Sanfey, if you had sort of an unmarked bag of lots of money to do more research, what are you curious in finding out more about right now?
Do you have? So is there an unmarked?
It's a hypothetical, but still, like if you.
So, well, what I'd really like to
required a lot of effort.
Yeah, so I'd really like to think about taking our lab studies into the wild. So doing kind of large-scale randomized control studies and looking to see how our conception of unfairness in a very toy lab context, how that translates to kind of real behavior in the real world. And they're, you know, noisy and messy studies, but I think ultimately we have to be able to take our findings and test them on actual behavior. So that would be my response to your hypothetical bag of money.
And I know you love feedback, so hands up if this lecture was relevant and valuable to you.
It's a brave person who keeps their hand down when I'm staring at you.
Thank you. To our online audience, almost everybody raised their hand. I hope you raised your hand in front of your screen as well. We're so happy that you could come to Stockholm. Thank you, Professor
Thank you very
Sanfey.
much.